You know, for literally thousands of years, there's this one concept that has deeply shaped how we think about the afterlife: hell. Today, we're going to examine its biblical framework and, just as importantly, the proposed way out, all based on a really powerful sermon.
So, just so we're all on the same page, the material we're looking at today comes from a compilation by Happy Akande, and it's really important to know that all the interpretations and verses we'll be discussing are pulled directly from the King James Version of the Bible.
Right from the jump, the sermon sets this incredibly serious tone with this opening line. The message is clear. This isn't just some abstract theological debate. It's something presented as being of urgent, eternal importance.
Okay, so here's how the sermon breaks this all down, and it's actually pretty clever. It uses a framework of 7 key points, and get this, they all start with the letter D. We're going to start with the first 3, which really try to define the basic nature of hell.
All right, our first D is for diverse definitions. And this is super interesting because you might think hell just means one thing, right? Well, not exactly. In the King James Bible, the term can actually mean different things. Sometimes it's translated from the Hebrew word Sheol, which just means the grave. Other times it's talking about just horrible earthly suffering. But the real focus of the sermon is on its most serious meaning, Gehenna, which is described as the literal place of torment.
Next up, the second D, dreadful descriptions. The sermon really paints a picture here, focusing on 4 key characteristics of this place. It talks about its duration, using the phrase everlasting fire. It describes the deprivation, the sense of lack, with everlasting thirst. It emphasizes the absolute separation with the idea of a great gulf fixed. And finally, it points to the disgrace, the shame of everlasting contempt.
And then we get to the third D, which is all about direction. The source material makes this super clear. It's a simple, stark contrast. The scriptures consistently talk about heaven as being upward, above, a place of glory. But hell, it's always described as downward, beneath, in the pit or the depths.
And to really drive that point home, the sermon pulls this quote from Isaiah. It really anchors that whole concept of a downward direction, painting this vivid picture of a realm stirring from beneath. Okay, so if that's the what and the where, the next big question has to be who, right? This next part dives right into that, focusing on the inhabitants, the specific dangers, and this overwhelming sense of finality. This brings us to our fourth D, destined dwellers. And the sermon lays out 4 pretty specific groups mentioned in the scriptures. It's not just individuals, but entire nations that are disobedient. It talks about religious hypocrites, what it calls deceivers. It mentions the angels who sinned, the defaulting, and finally, the deniers, those who don't obey the gospel. It's a really broad and sobering list. Okay, the fifth D zooms in on a really specific danger. The source makes a big deal about the term hellfire, and it points out that this exact phrase only shows up a handful of times in the King James Bible. Just 3, in fact. And here's the kicker. All 3 times, it's Jesus Christ himself who says it. The sermon uses this quote from Mark to show just how severe the warning is, describing this unending state where the decay, the worm, never dies and the fire is never, ever put out. All right, now for the 6th D, and this is a big one, the doom of the lake of fire. Now pay attention here because according to the sermon, this is not the same thing as hell. This is presented as the final, ultimate judgment, something called the second death. It's described as the place where not only unsaved people end up, but where the devil, the beast, and even the very concepts of death and hell are finally thrown. So, after walking through 6 points that paint a pretty grim picture, the whole sermon just pivots. It completely shifts gears from defining this huge problem to laying out what it says is the one and only solution, the path to deliverance. So that leads us to the most important question of all, doesn't it? If everything we've just heard is the reality being presented, how in the world does someone escape it? What's the way out?
And that brings us to the 7th and final D, deliverance. The sermon lays out a really clear 3-step path. And it's not about what you do physically. It's about these 3 spiritual actions. First, to believe, to put your faith in Jesus. Second, to be born again, to have that spiritual rebirth. And third, as a result of the first 2, to be in the book, to have your name written in the book of life.
And really, this whole path to deliverance is anchored by one core idea.
which is summed up perfectly in this verse from Acts. It all comes down to belief, that faith in Jesus Christ is presented as the one essential key to being saved.
So, we've gone through all 7 Ds. We've seen the definitions, the dangers, and the path to deliverance. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, the sermon really boils it all down to a single fundamental choice.
When you strip it all away, what we've really been looking at is a framework of 2 completely different eternal paths. The entire message is built on this contrast, presenting this stark choice, and what it argues is the only way to navigate it.
And that's really what this whole sermon is designed to do, to lead you to one final personal question. After laying out 2 totally different destinations, it kind of forces you to ask yourself, which one is getting your attention?